The Steam House by Jules Verne. Translated by Agnes D. Kingston. Book 1, Chapter 9. Allahabad. The distance between Benares and Allahabad is about 80 miles, and the road lies on the right bank of the Ganges between the railway and the river. Storr had loaded the tender with a good supply of coal, so that the elephant would have no lack of nourishment for several days. Well cleaned, I had almost said well curry-combed, as bright as if he had just come out of the workshop, he impatiently waited the moment for starting. He didn't exactly paw the ground, but the quivering of the wheels betrayed the tension of the steam which filled his lungs of steel. Our train started early in the morning of the 24th, at a rate of 3 to 4 miles an hour. The night passed quietly, and we saw nothing of the Bengali. I may as well mention here, once for all, that each day's program of getting up, going to bed, breakfasts, luncheons, dinners, and siestas was carried out with military exactitude. Our life in the steam-house went on as regularly as in the bungalow at Calcutta. The landscape was constantly changing under our eyes, without any perceptible movement of our house. We soon grew accustomed to our life, as do passengers on board an ocean steamer, though we had nothing monotonous, for, unlike the sea, our horizon was ever changing. Towards 11 o'clock we caught sight on the plain of a curious mausoleum, erected in honor of two holy personages of Islam, Qasim Soliman, father and son. Half an hour after this, we passed the important fortress of Chunar, an impregnable rock crowned by picturesque ramparts, and rising perpendicularly 150 feet above the river. Of course, we halted to pay this place a visit, as it is one of the most important fortresses in the valley of the Ganges. It is a very economical place with regard to expenditure of powder and bullets, for when an assaulting column endeavors to scale the walls, it is immediately crushed by an avalanche of rocks and stones kept for the purpose. At its foot lies the town which bears its name, the houses coquettishly peeping out from among the verdure. In Benares, as we have seen, there exist many privileged places, which are considered by the Hindus as the most sacred in the world. If one began to count, the numbers scattered over the peninsula would amount to hundreds. Chunar possesses one of these miraculous spots. Here you are shown a marble slab, to which some god or other comes regularly to take his daily siesta. It is true that he is invisible, so we did not stop to see him. That evening Behemoth halted near Mirzapur to pass the night. This town has no lack of temples, and has also manufactories and a wharf, from which our vessels are laden with the cotton grown in that territory. It will some day become a rich commercial city. About 2 o'clock next day we forded the little river Tansa, at that time only containing a foot of water. Then, 5 hours after, we passed the point where the great branch line from Bombay to Calcutta joins the main railway, near the place where the Jumna falls into the Ganges. We admired the magnificent iron viaduct, its 16 piers, 60 feet in height, washed by the waters of this superb confluent. We had to cross this river by means of a bridge of boats, over half a mile in length, which we accomplished without much difficulty, and by the evening were encamped at the end of one of the suburbs of Allahabad. The 26th we devoted to visiting this important town, which is a junction of all the principal railways in Hindustan. Its situation is admirable, in the midst of a rich territory between the two arms of the Jumna and Ganges. Nature certainly has done everything in her power to fit Allahabad to be the capital of British India, the centre of government and residence of the Viceroy, and it is not impossible that it will one day become so if the cyclones play enough mischief with Calcutta, the actual metropolis. Some clever heads must already have foreseen this contingency, for in this great body called India, Allahabad is placed where the heart should be, just as Paris is the heart of France. London is not in the centre of the United Kingdom, it is true, but then London has not the same preeminence over other great English cities, such as Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, that Paris has over all the other towns in France. "And starting from here," said I to Banks, "shall we proceed in a straight and northerly direction?" "Yes," replied Banks, "or rather almost straight, Allahabad being the western limit of this, the first part of our expedition." "After all," cried Captain Hood, "these great towns are very well in their way, but give me an open plain or a tangled jungle. If we always keep near railways like this, we shall end by running on them ourselves, and our behemoth will be turned into a common engine. What a come-down!" "Cheer up! Don't be uneasy, Hood," returned the engineer. "That won't happen. We shall soon venture into your favourite parts." "Then, Banks, do we make straight for the Indo-Chinese frontier without going through Lucknow?" "My advice is that we should avoid that town, and more especially Cawnpore, a place so full of terrible recollections for Colonel Munro." "You are right," I replied. "We can't keep too far away from it." "I say, Banks," asked Captain Hood, "didn't you hear anything about Nana Sahib during your visit to Benares?" "Nothing," answered the engineer. "It's very probable that the governor of Bombay may have been misled, and that the Nana never reappeared in the presidency of Bombay." "That is very likely," answered the captain. "Otherwise the old rebel would already have made himself talked of." "However that may be," said Banks, "I am anxious to leave the Ganges Valley. It has been the scene of so many disasters during the Sepoy Mutiny, from Allahabad to Cawnpore, but we must be especially careful that neither the latter town nor the name of Nana Sahib should be mentioned before the colonel. Do not let us awake painful recollections." On the next day Banks again wished to accompany me during the few hours I was able to spend in Allahabad. One might easily have spent 3 days in exploring the 3 towns of which it is composed, but it is less curious than Benares, although numbered among the holy cities. There is really nothing to say about the Hindu part of the town. It is simply a mass of low houses, separated by narrow streets, shaded by magnificent tamarind trees. Of the English town and cantonments there is not much to be said either. The fine, well-planted avenues, wealthy habitations, and wide squares all look as if the town was destined to become a great capital. Allahabad is situated on a vast plain, bounded on the north and south by the double course of the Jumna and Ganges. It is called the Plain of Almsgiving, because the Hindu princes have at all times come here to perform works of charity. Monsieur Rousselet, quoting a passage from the Life of Hionan's Thang, says, "It is more meritorious to give away 1 piece of money in this place than 100,000 elsewhere." Now for a few words about the fort of Allahabad, which is well worth a visit. It is constructed to the west of the great almsgiving plain, from which its high granite walls stand boldly out. In the middle of the fort is a palace, now used as an arsenal, though formerly the favourite residence of the Sultan Akbar. In one of the corners is the Lat of Pharaoh's Shaks, a superb monolith 36 feet in height, supporting a lion. Not far off is a little temple which no Hindu can visit, as they are refused admission into the fort, although it is one of the most sacred places in the world. Such are the principal objects of interest. Banks told me that the fort of Allahabad also has its legend, which reminds one of the story relative to the reconstruction of Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. When the Sultan wished to build this fort, it seems that the stones turned very refractory. Directly a wall was built, it tumbled itself down again. The oracle was consulted. The oracle replied, as usual, that a voluntary victim must be offered to remove this spell. A Hindu offered himself as a holocaust. He was sacrificed, and the fort was soon finished. This man was called Brog, and that is the reason why the town is still designated by the double name of Brog Allahabad. Banks took us to the deservedly celebrated gardens of Khusru. Here numerous Mohammedan mausoleums stand under the shade of beautiful tamarinds. One of them is the last resting place of the Sultan from whom these gardens take their name. On one of the white marble walls is printed the palm of an enormous hand. This was pointed out to us with a complacency which was lacking in the exhibition of the sacred impressions at Gaya. It is true this was not the print of a god's foot, but that of the hand of a simple mortal, the great-nephew of Mohammed. During the insurrection of 1857, blood flowed as freely in Allahabad as in the other towns of the Ganges Valley. The fight between the English and the mutineers on the drill ground at Benares caused the rising of the native troops, and in particular the revolt of the 6th Regiment of the Bengal Army. 8 ensigns were massacred to begin with, but thanks to the energetic conduct of some European artillerymen who were at Chunar, the sepoys ended by laying down their arms. It was a more serious affair in the cantonments. The natives rose, threw open the prisons, pillaged the docks, and set fire to the European houses. In the midst of all this, Colonel Neil, who had re-established order at Benares, arrived with his own regiment and 100 Fusiliers belonging to a Madras regiment. He retook the bridge of boats, seized the suburbs of the town, dispersed the members of a provisional government installed by a Mussulman, and very soon again became master of the province. During our short excursions in Allahabad, Banks and I carefully watched to see if we were followed there as we had been in Benares, but saw nothing to arouse our suspicions. "Never mind," said the engineer. "We must all the same be on our guard. I should have liked to have travelled incognito, for Colonel Munro's name is too well known among the natives of this province." At 6 o'clock we returned to dinner. Sir Edward, who had left the encampment for an hour or two, had also come back, and was waiting for us, as was Captain Hood, who had been visiting some of his old comrades in the cantonment. I observed to Banks that Colonel Munro seemed not more sad, but more anxious than was his wont. There appeared in his eyes a latent fire that tears should surely long ago have extinguished. "You are right," answered Banks. "There is something the matter. What can have happened?" "Suppose you ask McNeil," said I. "Ah, yes, perhaps he will know." And, leaving the drawing-room, the engineer opened the door of the sergeant's cabin. He was not there. "Where is McNeil?" asked Banks of Gumi, who was getting ready to wait at table. "He has left the camp," replied Gumi. "How long?" "He went nearly an hour ago, by Colonel Munro's orders." "You do not know where he has gone?" "No, Sahib, and I cannot tell why he went." "Nothing fresh has happened here since we left?" "Nothing, Sahib." Banks returned, and telling me of the sergeant's absence for a reason that no one knew, he repeated, "I do not know what it is, but very certainly there is something up. We must wait and see." Everyone now sat down to table. Ordinarily, Colonel Munro took part in the conversation during meals. He liked to hear us relate our adventures and excursions, and was interested in all we had been doing during the day. I always took care to avoid speaking of anything that could in the slightest degree remind him of the mutiny. I think that he perceived this, but whether he appreciated it or not, it was sometimes difficult enough to maintain this reserve, especially when we talked of towns such as Benares and Allahabad. During dinner, on the evening of which I speak, I feared being obliged to speak of Allahabad. I need not have been afraid, however. Colonel Munro questioned neither Banks nor myself about the occupation of our day. He remained mute during the whole of dinner, and as time went on his preoccupation visibly increased. He cast frequent glances along the road which led to the cantonments, and several times was evidently on the point of rising from table, the better to see in that direction. It was plain that he was impatiently awaiting the return of Sergeant McNeil. Our meal was dull enough. Hood looked interrogatively at Banks, as if to ask him what was the matter, but Banks knew no more than he did. When dinner at last came to an end, Colonel Munro, instead of as usual lying down to take a nap, stepped down from the veranda, went a few paces along the road, gave one long look down it, then, returning toward us, "Banks, Hood, and you too, Mauclair," he said. "Will you accompany me as far as the nearest houses of the cantonments?" We all immediately rose and followed the colonel, who walked slowly on without uttering a word. After proceeding thus for about 100 paces, Sir Edward stopped before a post standing on the right-hand side of the road, and having a notice stuck on it. "Read that," he said. It was the placard, already more than 2 months old, which put a price on the head of Nana Sahib, and gave notice of his presence in the presidency of Bombay. Banks and Hood could scarcely conceal their disappointment. While still in Calcutta and during the journey, they had so managed up to the present time that this notice had never come under the colonel's eyes. But now a vexatious chance had baffled all their precautions. "Banks," said Sir Edward, seizing the engineer's hand, "did you know of this notice?" Banks made no reply. "You knew 2 months ago," continued the colonel, "of this announcement that Nana Sahib was in the presidency of Bombay, and yet you said nothing to me." Banks remained silent, not knowing what to say. "Well, yes, Colonel," exclaimed Captain Hood. "We did know of it. But what was the use of telling you? Who was to prove that the fact announced by this notice was true? And what was the good of bringing to your mind those painful recollections which do you so much harm?" "Banks," cried Colonel Munro, his face, as it were, transformed, "have you forgotten that it is my right, that I of all men must do justice on that wretch? Know this, when I consented to leave Calcutta, I did so because this journey would take me to the north of India, because I never even for a single day believed in the death of Nana Sahib, and because I will never relinquish my purpose of vengeance. In setting out with you, I had but one idea, one hope. For the attainment of my purpose, on the chances of the journey and the aid of heaven I had relied. I was right in doing so. Heaven directed me to this notice. It is in the south, and not in the north, that Nana Sahib must be sought for. Be it so. I shall go south." We had not been mistaken in our fears. It was but too true. A fancy, nay more, a fixed idea, still governed the mind of Colonel Munro. He had just disclosed it to us. "Munro," returned Banks, "if I said nothing to you about this, it was because I did not believe in Nana Sahib's being in the Bombay presidency. It is probable that the authorities have been once more mistaken. In fact, that notice is dated the 6th of March, and since that time nothing has been heard to corroborate the statement of the appearance of the nabob." At first Colonel Munro made no answer to the engineer's observation. He took another look along the road, then said, "My friends, I am about to hear the latest news. McNeil has gone to Allahabad with a letter for the governor. In a few minutes I shall know whether Nana Sahib did indeed reappear in one of the western provinces, whether he is there still, or whether he has again been lost sight of." "And if he has been seen, if the fact is indisputable, what shall you do, Munro?" asked Banks, grasping the colonel's hand. "I shall go," replied Sir Edward, "as is my duty, where justice leads me." "That is positively decided, Munro?" "Yes, Banks, positively. You must continue your travels without me, my friends. I shall take the train to Bombay this evening." "But not alone," responded the engineer, turning towards us. "We will accompany you, Munro." "Yes, yes, Colonel," exclaimed Captain Hood. "We shall certainly not let you go without us, Instead of hunting wild beasts, we will hunt villains." "Colonel Monroe," I added, "will you allow me to join the captain as one of your friends?" "Yes, Mauclair," replied Banks. "This very evening we will leave Allahabad." "It is needless," said a grave voice behind us. We all turned and beheld Sergeant McNeill standing with a newspaper in his hand. "Read, Colonel," said he. "This is what the governor desired me to show you." Sir Edward took the paper and read as follows: "The governor of the Bombay Presidency requests the public to take notice that the proclamation of the 6th of March respecting the Nabob Dandu Pant must now be considered as cancelled. Nana Sahib was yesterday attacked in the defiles of the Satpura Mountains, where he had taken refuge with his band, and was killed in the skirmish. The body has been identified by the inhabitants of Kanpur and Lucknow. A finger is wanting on the left hand, and it is known that Nana Sahib had one amputated at the time when his mock obsequies were celebrated to make people believe in his death. The Kingdom of India has now nothing further to dread from the machinations of the cruel Nabob who has cost her so much blood." Colonel Monroe read these lines in a hollow voice. Then the paper fell from his hands. We remained silent. Nana Sahib's death, now indisputable, delivered us from all fear as to the future. Colonel Monroe said nothing for some minutes, but stood with his hand pressed over his eyes, as if to efface all frightful recollections. Then, "When should we leave Allahabad?" he asked. "Tomorrow at daybreak," replied the engineer. "Banks," resumed Sir Edward, "could we not stop for a few hours at Cawnpore?" "You wish it?" "Yes, Banks, I should like it. I must see Cawnpore once again, for the last time." "We shall be there in a couple of days," replied the engineer quietly. "And after that?" said the colonel. "After that," answered Banks, "we shall continue our expedition to the north of India." "Yes, to the north," said the colonel in a tone which stirred me to the depths of my heart. In truth, it was likely that Sir Edward Monroe still entertained some doubt as to the real result of that last skirmish between Nana Sahib and the English. Yet what reason could he have for disbelieving such evidence as this? The future alone could explain. End of Book 1, Chapter 9.